He once turned his own father's wedding announcement into a joke so quickly, so automatically, that the people around him barely had time to register what he'd actually just revealed. Not because the news didn't matter to him, because making it funny immediately, before anyone else could react to it first, was the only way Chandler Bing had ever learned to survive news that actually hurt. Chandler Bing never needed to be funny. He needed to say the painful thing before it could say something worse about him first. Welcome back to the Character Couch. I've rewatched this show enough times to finish his one-liners before he says them, and for years I laughed at Chandler the same way everyone does, the sarcastic friend who can't take anything seriously, especially not himself. But you don't just see a man with impeccable comic timing. You see someone who turned jokes into a permanent shield, deployed instantly, every single time something real threatened to get too close. By the end of this video, every deflecting joke Chandler Bing has ever made is going to sound a lot less like wit and a lot more like a flinch. There's a term for what Chandler does. Psychologists call it humor as a defense mechanism, a pattern where jokes are deployed not for entertainment, but to interrupt an emotion before it has time to fully land on the speaker or on anyone watching. It works by getting there first. If you make the painful thing funny before anyone else can react to it, you control how it lands, and you never have to sit in the silence that follows an honest reaction. Chandler doesn't joke because he's naturally lighthearted. He jokes because silence for him has always felt considerably more dangerous than mockery. Chandler has described, more than once, the exact Thanksgiving his parents announced their divorce, a memory sharp enough that he associates the entire holiday with dread decades later. The announcement itself, delivered at a family dinner table in front of him, is the kind of moment a child doesn't get to process privately. He has to react in real time, in public, with no space to simply feel it first. That single afternoon becomes a template. Faced with devastating news delivered at the worst possible moment, young Chandler apparently discovered that making a joke, however small, gave him something to do with the feeling besides simply drowning in it. It wasn't a strategy he consciously chose. It was the only exit available in a moment that offered him no other option. That exit became a permanent habit, one he'd reach for automatically every time real emotion threatened to surface unguarded, starting with the two people who caused it in the first place. Chandler's father, Charles, left the family and eventually became a performer in Las Vegas, living publicly as a woman under a different name, a fact the show treats with considerable comedy, but which represents a genuinely significant rupture in Chandler's childhood. Their relationship remains strained and distant for most of Chandler's adult life, marked by long silences rather than open conflict. The specific nature of that estrangement matters. Chandler isn't just missing a present father. He's missing one whose entire adult identity became a source of public spectacle, something Chandler learned to deflect with a joke before anyone else could bring it up first, a defense against ridicule that started long before he ever needed it at Central Perk. Making peace with that relationship, however incompletely, becomes one of the quieter through lines of Chandler's growth, especially once he's forced to face his father again around his own wedding. Chandler's mother, Nora, is a successful romance novelist whose books contain explicit content Chandler finds excruciating to discuss, a recurring joke throughout the series. Beneath the comedy sits a mother who is charming and self-assured in public, but whose attention toward her son often feels secondary to her own career and social life. That dynamic teaches a particular lesson, that Chandler's own feelings were rarely the priority in the room, and that competing for his mother's genuine attention wasn't reliably successful. Humor becomes a workaround for that scarcity too, a way to be noticed briefly without requiring the kind of sustained emotional attention Nora rarely seemed available to give. Between an absent spectacle-making father and a self-absorbed, if affectionate, mother, Chandler arrived at adulthood with a well-practiced skill, performing enough charm to get a reaction without ever expecting anyone to look past the performance. Chandler's friendship with Joey, spanning from college roommates through years of shared apartments, is one of the most consistently warm relationships in the entire series. What makes it work isn't intellectual compatibility. It's that Joey never requires Chandler to be clever to earn his loyalty. He simply likes him uncomplicatedly, jokes or no jokes. That unconditional quality matters enormously for someone whose entire emotional survival strategy depends on performing wit to be worth keeping around. Joey doesn't need the performance. He's there during Chandler's worst moments and his best ones with the same steady, undemanding affection, offering something close to what neither of Chandler's parents fully provided. Attention that doesn't have to be earned through entertainment. It's the first stable proof in Chandler's adult life that being liked doesn't always require constant vigilance, and it sets the stage for every other relationship where he slowly, painfully, learns to believe the same thing. Chandler's on-again, off-again relationship with Janice becomes one of the show's longest-running jokes, defined by his repeated, often cowardly attempts to end things rather than communicate honestly. Each breakup is engineered through some elaborate, joke-laden avoidance rather than direct conversation, a pattern that recurs so often it becomes a defining character trait. That avoidance isn't really about Janice specifically. It's Chandler's default response whenever a relationship starts requiring the kind of vulnerable honesty his childhood never modeled for him. Breaking up honestly would mean sitting in an uncomfortable, unfunny conversation, exactly the kind of moment he spent his entire life engineering an exit from. Janice becomes, unintentionally, a recurring stress test for exactly how far Chandler will go to avoid real emotional confrontation, right up until a relationship comes along that he can't joke his way out of wanting. Chandler's relationship with Monica represents the clearest turning point in his emotional life. Unlike his previous relationships, he doesn't deflect his way through the important moments, the proposal, the wedding, the eventual adoption of their children. He shows up repeatedly with an honesty that would have been unthinkable earlier in the series. What makes this possible is largely Monica herself, someone who doesn't let Chandler retreat into jokes when something real is actually happening, while also never punishing him for using humor in lower-stakes moments. She gives him room to be exactly as funny as he naturally is, without requiring the humor to substitute for genuine intimacy when it actually counts. That balance, acceptance without demanding he abandon who he is, finally gives Chandler a template for connection that doesn't require constant performance to sustain, something neither parent nor Janice had ever quite offered him. Chandler's friendship with Ross, dating back to college, is one of the steadiest relationships in his adult life, built on years of shared history and easy, low-stakes ribbing. Their dynamic allows for genuine affection expressed almost entirely through jokes, without either of them needing to name it directly as anything deeper. That's precisely what makes the friendship work for someone like Chandler. It offers real intimacy disguised as banter, letting him experience closeness without the vulnerability of ever having to call it that. Ross rarely pushes Chandler to be more emotionally direct than he's comfortable with, and in turn receives some of Chandler's most genuine loyalty, especially during Ross's own repeated personal crises. It's a friendship built entirely in Chandler's preferred emotional language, proving that even his defense mechanism could still carry real, lasting connection, just translated into a dialect only his closest friends fully understood. To understand Chandler fully, it helps to understand the broader cultural moment his childhood took place in. American divorce rates rose sharply through the 1970s and into the 1980s, producing a generation of children navigating fractured households without much cultural language yet for processing that disruption openly. Chandler's specific coping mechanism, deflecting pain through humor rather than direct expression, reflects a broader pattern common among children of that era, where therapy and open emotional discussion were far less normalized than they are today, and where humor often served as one of the only culturally acceptable outlets available to a child who didn't want to seem like they were struggling. That generational context doesn't excuse or fully explain Chandler's specific defense mechanism, but it does situate it. He wasn't uniquely broken. He was a fairly typical product of an era that gave children of divorce very few better tools to work with. There's a second layer of context worth examining. Chandler's job, famously never fully explained on screen beyond vague references to statistical analysis and data reconfiguration, reflects a specific cultural moment in corporate America. The rise of anonymous, cubicle-based white-collar work, where employees could spend years in roles even their closest friends couldn't accurately describe. That professional facelessness mirrors Chandler's emotional strategy almost perfectly. Just as he deflects personal vulnerability through jokes, his career allows him to exist inside a system that requires no one, including himself, to examine too closely what he's actually doing there or whether it means anything to him. It's a job built for avoidance, in an era of corporate culture that made that kind of avoidance entirely unremarkable. His eventual decision to leave that job for something he actually wants marks one of the clearest signs of genuine change, choosing a real ambition instead of a comfortable, anonymous default. Chandler's friendship with Phoebe Buffet is a quieter dynamic than his bond with Joey or Ross, but a notable one. Phoebe, who experienced her own genuinely chaotic and unconventional childhood, relates to Chandler with an unusual directness, unbothered by his deflections, occasionally seeing straight through them without taking offense. Their shared, if very different, experiences of unstable family backgrounds create a specific kind of mutual recognition the other friendships don't quite offer. Phoebe doesn't need Chandler's humor explained or excused. She simply understands, on some level, exactly what kind of household produces someone who jokes his way through everything. Because her own upbringing taught her similar survival skills, just expressed differently. It's a smaller relationship in the show's overall architecture, but it offers Chandler something specific. Recognition from someone who never requires him to translate his defense mechanism into something more palatable. Chandler's brief, guilt-ridden relationship with Kathy, who was dating Joey at the time feelings developed between them, is one of the more genuinely painful storylines involving Chandler straining his friendship with Joey seriously for the first time in the show's run. Unlike most of his romantic entanglements, Chandler can't joke his way out of the consequences here. The guilt is real, and so is the damage to a friendship that has always been one of his safest emotional anchors. What's notable is how little humor Chandler deploys during this storyline compared to nearly everything else in his arc. The stakes are too real, the betrayal too significant for his usual defense mechanism to function the way it normally does. It's one of the only times the show lets us see Chandler fully unprotected, without a joke ready to soften the moment. That rare vulnerability, however uncomfortable to watch, reveals exactly how much his humor depends on the situation feeling survivable. When it doesn't, the jokes simply stop working, and what's left underneath them finally becomes visible. But here's the part that caught me completely off guard. Joey Tribbiani, the one everyone frames as the simple, easygoing friend just along for the laughs, largely unaffected by anyone's deeper baggage, he's also, and I cannot believe I'm saying this, someone who needed Chandler's humor just as much as Chandler needed Joey's unconditional loyalty. Think about it. Joey's own family life, chaotic, loving, but rarely quiet, gave him plenty of noise and affection, but not always the kind of steady, witty companionship Chandler provided daily for years. Chandler's jokes weren't just a defense mechanism performed at Joey. They became one of Joey's primary sources of daily entertainment and connection, in an apartment that might otherwise have felt considerably lonelier for a struggling actor without much else going reliably right in his life. So the friend everyone assumes simply tolerated Chandler's constant deflecting turns out to have been quietly relying on that exact same humor to make his own uncertain years feel less isolating, long before either of them ever thought to call that reliance what it actually was. What Chandler deserved, back at that Thanksgiving table, and in all the quiet years that followed it, was proof that a painful moment didn't have to be diffused immediately to be survivable. Not a joke ready before the silence could even fully land. Not a defense mechanism built at a dinner table he never got to leave. What he actually received was a single afternoon that taught him silence was dangerous, and humor was the only reliable exit, a lesson he'd keep relearning with every relationship that came close enough to matter. He built an entire personality out of getting there first, so pain would never again catch him without an exit ready. He built it so well, he nearly missed the people who never needed the performance at all. And in Joey's uncomplicated loyalty, in Monica's patient acceptance, In a wedding day, he showed up to fully, without a single deflecting joke. That was the boy from that Thanksgiving table, finally, quietly, discovering that some moments were safe enough to simply feel. The jokes were never about the jokes. They never were. So was Chandler Bing simply the funny one, or a man hiding in plain sight? Neither, honestly. Chandler wasn't a naturally hilarious man who happened to have a difficult childhood, and he wasn't a wounded man merely performing wit for effect. He was someone who turned one devastating Thanksgiving into an entire language of deflection, because getting their fur first with a joke always felt safer than waiting to see how badly the silence might land. Maybe that's truer of more of us than we'd like to admit. Sometimes the person making everyone laugh isn't avoiding the moment because it doesn't matter to him. He's avoiding it because it matters more than he's ever fully let himself say out loud. So here's what I want to know. If Chandler had never sat through that one Thanksgiving dinner, do you think he still becomes a man who jokes his way through everything difficult? Or was that habit always going to find him somewhere, given the rest of his childhood? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more of these deep dives into the characters you thought you already understood, hit subscribe. The couch is always open.